Okay, so I'm transferring to a blender. Yeah, I'm gonna try to do a blender, which one is normal, Okay, okay, so I'm gonna load up the material. Yes, donuts.
So what is the plan? Gorgeous views, stroll on the beach, old stuff, take in a bit of art, finish it.
This is Blender, open source 3D software that can be used to make animations, visual effects, game assets, or practically anything 3D. And best of all, it's 100% free and it always will be. If you've never used it before but you want to learn it, well, then you're in the right place. This is a tutorial for complete beginners. I've been using Blender for 20 years, so I'm going to show you how to use all of its core features. And by the end, you'll finish with not only the confidence to start your own projects, but with your very own donut animation. One artist even snuck his into a little film called Everything Everywhere All at Once. Very clever. So if you're ready to take your first steps in download or just click the link in the description. Then you'll spend probably. So let's delete shaders or complexities of scenes. So 3ds Max has the Utah teapot, Houdini has the toy, and I think Pig's head. Blender has the monkey, and it's actually called the Suzanne monkey head, which you can see in the top left there, named after the orangutan from the film Jay and Silent. Now we know how Blender functions, let's start building that donut. So, as before, well, first of all, just to repeat, make sure you are working with a new scene. Completely new scene, don't want any remaining monkey heads lying around. Let's begin fresh slate, and let's delete our default cube, just with the delete key, and let's replace it with a new object. You might remember the hotkey for that is Shift A. And as I mentioned before, you usually want what is underneath mesh because these are your primitives. So we want to start with something that most resembles what it is we're building. If it was a house, you might start with a cube. If it was a vase, you might start with a cylinder. In our case, we want the donut shaped one, although mathematicians call it a torus for some reason. So let's add that. Now,
George, ring, beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Oh, yes, yes. What did you expect?
Now, if I zoom in by scrolling up, we can see we have something resembling a donut. It looks like a pretty weak looking donut, very flimsy. Looks like the donut before it's cooked when they just drop it into the vat and it's just this little wispy thing. Um, so, immediately after you do some actions in Blender, you have options to change it. And the options are hidden down here in the bottom left hand corner. You see a little box, and if you click that box, you see options. And look, we can change the dimensions.
Okay, yeah.
Um, so immediately after you do some actions in Blender, you have options to change it. And the options are hidden down here in the bottom left-hand corner. You see a little box, and if you click that box, you see options. And look, we can change the dimensions of our torus. Now, something to note is that these options in Blender only appear immediately after you have done that action. If you do another action, like say deselect your torus by mistake, it's gone, right? Because Blender has assumed you have moved on. You've accepted the state of your donut, and this is the one you want, right? Now, if you haven't done anything drastic or changed this object in some severe way, you can temporarily bring it back by hitting F9. I never actually remember that hotkey. I just remember that immediately after I have added an object, if I want to tweak it, now's my chance before I move on to something else. Okay. So we could change, the size of it here. We can also change the resolution. I'll use the term resolution loosely, to make it higher or lower fidelity. And a mistake that a lot of beginners make, and I say this because this was the exact mistake I made way back in 2003 when I started learning Blender, is they go, well, I need a realistic looking donut, so I guess I need to go really high resolution. I remember my first project, one of my first projects was for a high school film project, and I wanted to have a close-up of a face. Didn't realize faces were going to be difficult, but I went really high poly, and then it was just an absolute nightmare to work with. So the reason you don't want this is that work with, if you want to discover that it is, take it away if you've already built it into it and you don't need it. So these are called polys, as you can get away with. So I'm going to go with 32 major and 12 minor. And don't worry that it looks all jagged, because we will fix that in a moment. Now, the major and minor, this is really up to you, but I find that something that looks kind of chunky, like a fat donut, just looks really delicious. So I'm going with something around about this size, okay? And once I'm happy with this, once I'm ready to click off, I click off, the options are gone, and this is it. This is the donut that I am now working with. So how do we make this look higher resolution, less jagged? Well, one way is to use smooth shading. So if you right click with your object selected, go to shade smooth. And look at that, this is immediately better. Without getting too technical, this is kind of a fakery. It's sort of like the shader is telling the renderer that this is a really high poly dense mesh when it really isn't. It's just basically kind of like averaging out faces, and anyway, it's very technical, but basically means it's not going to add anything to your render time, but it's going to look smoother. And so this is generally what you want for something that is smooth and organic looking, like we want. If you were rendering like architectural or like hard surfaces, like later on we're going to put this on a counter, then the object would obviously want to be flat. But in our case, we're just going to use shade smooth. But you might notice that looking at this, especially if you go side on, that you've got this sort of jagged shape around here, right? So the silhouette is really breaking that illusion that this is a high poly or a smooth looking donut. But thankfully, rather than adding all of that complex density into the mesh itself and then making it hard to remove later on, there is another way through modifiers. So if we go over here to our properties, right, this very confusing, lots of option looking properties, click on the wrench, and this is the section called modifiers. And this is one of those object dependent things. So if you've got your camera selected, you won't see it. So it's only when you've got actual meshes that you might see this modifier here. So it's much easier to explain if we just add one. So up here, add modifier, and you got a range of options.
So I'm just gonna find where they live. Oh wait, I know where the studio is, huh? I know where the studio is. I've seen it before. time it crashes. That'd be funny. Oh, thank you. Beautiful. Yeah, I find it. Beautiful.
Options here that can do a whole number of things. The one that we're looking for is underneath generate, and it is called subdivision surface. And it is a really common modifier that you use all the time. In fact, it's so common, it's actually, you can just immediately add it to any object just by hitting Control 1. But don't do that because we've already got it, so there. Now, some of you might have just discovered that your donut has disappeared. If that is the case, you need to go to Edit, Preferences, and then underneath Viewport, where it's got Subdivision at the very bottom, disable GPU subdivision. That will then make the subdivision perform on your CPU instead of your GPU, which is maybe non-existent or not performing whatever. But disable that and it should appear. But if it's already working for you, don't disable it. Keep it going because GPU will be faster. So what exactly is this doing? Well, it's a lot easier to explain if we look at the shade flat mode, because we're not being tricked by the smooth shading there. If I set this levels viewport to 0, this is our original mesh. This is before we add the subsurface essentially. When we increase this, you can see that it is adding resolution to our mesh. And the more I increase this viewport levels here, the finer and finer that detail becomes. So to explain it, because this is such a very, very common modifier, it's kind of important to understand how it's working. You can see that this is these squares here, these are called faces, by the way. And for each one of these faces here, as I add a level, you can see it's becoming 4 faces, right? And then now if I zoomed in on this one face here, if I do another level, that's now become 4 faces. And then if I zoom in again, it's now become 4 faces. So it's exponentially adding detail. And you might also know that it is smoothing it out as well. Like this jagged edge that we've got here, you can see now becomes smoother. So to quickly visualize that, if I just draw it, like imagine you've got like a 90-degree corner, right? Like this. If you add a subsurf modifier, what it's going to do is it's going to add a point here, right? Because this is the extra detail. It's also going to take that point there and it's going to average it out. It's going to average it out between these points. And it's going to create another one there and another one there. So you go then from having that really hard corner there to having something that looks a lot smoother. So it's going to take a point and it's also going to change it to make it look smoother, generally speaking. So there we go. So now as I increase this, you can see it's getting smoother and smoother. Now, the reason there are 2 options here, you've got levels viewport and levels render. So reminder, this gray area that we operate in is called our viewport. The render is the pretty version. So as an example, you can see if I just turned it off for the viewport, it looks very jagged. But then for my render, if I increase that to 3, if I do my render, which you could go up there, and render image, or remember the hotkey F12, you can see that that donut is now smooth, but I go back and you can see it's jagged. So the viewport, you want to generally keep it lightweight, and then the render time, that's where you want to get a really nice looking pretty image. So you want to often have 2 different levels. In our case though, I don't really think we need to go beyond 1, even for our final pretty image, because this with shade smoothing turned on is good enough. And we're going to be adding more to the scene later on, so we don't want to make it too complex. So this is actually pretty good. Okay, so we have a perfect donut, and that's the problem. It's too perfect. You could spend decades trying to develop a machine in the real world that made a donut this perfect, and you never would. This is so mathematically precise that the eye will always see this as looking fake. So that's actually a problem you learn pretty quickly in 3D, that things that are too perfect just look fake. So you have to spend time making things look misshapen and adding variation there like you see in the real world, because your eye expects to see it. So how do we do that? How do we make this donut look a little more lumpy and interesting? I do that by changing the mesh itself. So this mode that we are in right now, where we can click on different objects, is called object mode. And I know that because in the top left hand corner you can see we are in object mode. But if I click the drop down, you can see I get a number of other options here. And these options again will change depending on the object you've got selected. If I've got a lamp, my little mode, but ooh, Right. Now, you can see our our object has become something that looks weird. It's got a bunch of little points on it with lines and very technical. Well, that's because this is actually what the mesh is made up of. These little points here, which you can click on just by selecting, are called your vertices. The singular term is called vertex. I never say that. I like to just call all of them vertices, regardless of whether it's one or two, just because you always get some comments that go, actually, it's called vertex if it is singular. Anyway, so these are called your vertices, and if you have two of them joined by a line, that is called an edge, and if you have four of them forming a face, then it's called a face. So with these, I can quickly change the shape of my object by using the same hotkeys as before, and if I want to move this, then I would simply tap G, right? And you can see it's now attached to my cursor, and then if I want to confirm its movement, I just do a single left click, and there it is. Now if I go back into object mode, like that, you can see that my mesh has changed, okay? And by the way, the hotkey for jumping in and out of object and edit mode is just tab, okay? So you can see it's just toggling between those two modes because it's so common that you want to just quickly change things that it's just easily accessible by that. Now, this is okay, right? But you can see it's got like some artifacting. It's not the greatest lump, right? So how do we make it look a little more natural? Well, I mean, you could, you move one, drag it out, okay, click, and then I move, the next one next to it, right? I'll move that out, and then I'll move this one out a little bit, and then I move this one out. And it's like, okay, well now I've got the thing, but it took me like 5 actions. Ridiculous, right? No one wants to do that. No one's got time for that. Thankfully, there is a tool in Blender just for this, and it's called proportional editing, and you can enable it up there in your toolbar. So if you enable that, now if I hit G and I move it out, you will see I get a little ring around my cursor there, and that is now changing the mesh around it. Now, a lot of people in my previous tutorials were like, I don't see what's going on. You have to have something selected first, and then when you hit G, you will see that little circle of influence. Okay, now this circle of influence, if I scroll up, you can see it's shrinking its circle of influence. And if I scroll down, it is expanding its influence. So it's only going to affect what is in that ring there, okay? If you are on, if you don't have a mouse with a scroll wheel, you can also change the influence by using page up and page down. And if you don't have page up or page down because you're on a Mac keyboard, then what you would have to do is go to key map and then change your page up and page down to something else just so that you could get around that. But guys, you got to get a mouse. Get a mouse with a scroll wheel. I think they're, 50 cents or just in the nearest landfill somewhere. Get a mouse because it's going to make your life in 3D a lot easier. Okay, so with this, I can now make quick work of lumpy shapes, okay? So I just drag that out. Okay, I've got a little lumpy shape there. Maybe I go down here and I I pull this up just by hitting G, moving it up. Okay, so already this is looking a little more natural, right? Because even if we were making a stylized world for a Pixar movie or something like that, you can't have just a spherical looking donut, sorry, spherical, round looking circular donut, because it just, your eye will see it as fake. So very quickly, I'm able to add a little bit of variation to the donut. Just all around it, just a little bit over here. And you can see that I am just changing my circle of influence depending on what size of a lump I want to make that. And you just want to do that until you get something that looks a little more natural. I might want to make the inner part as well. We just drag that in with a smaller circle, and that's pretty good. Let's just have a look from the top. I might actually just drag that out, make it a little bit more.
Building your business online?
No.
Go to Wix.com and get your site up and running with
Like that. But there you go. That's pretty good for a donut. It's still kind of simple. It's not too detailed, but it's got just enough variation in it that it's more interesting to look at. Oh, one more thing I forgot to mention. Go back into edit mode with tab. Donuts, when they're sitting in the little vat thing, right, they're only like half submerged, so then they have to be flipped. But it means that the bit that's nearest to the surface is getting less heat. So essentially what I'm saying is the bit that's around the donut, the circumference of it, is usually a little bit flatter. So donuts aren't like perfectly round all the way around. They're usually a little bit flatter. So what I want to do is I want to select these vertices along here, and then I want to shrink them. Now I could go around one by one like this, which is actually what I used to do when I was learning Blender pre-YouTube days, and there was no tutorials. What I would do this if I wanted to select this. Silly, because there's a function, a tool for that, and it is edge select. So if you hold down Alt on your keyboard and then do a single left click on not the points, but on the edge, right, this little line here, you can see it's selected all.
Oh. Oh. That's easy.
All the way around. So it's anything that's connected along that line is now selected. So if I want to shrink this, right, what would I do? Well, I mean, yeah, you could like move it around, right? We want to shrink it. We want to change the scale of it. So we would use the hotkey S for scale. So S, and I'm going to scale that in. And I actually don't want proportional editing, so I'm going to turn that off and now scale in and just make it a little bit flatter. And there you go. See, it just feels a little bit more natural, doesn't it? It looks a little bit closer to what a donut looks like. And by the way, don't worry if yours doesn't look exactly like this, like your lump is a little bit off. Like some people get a little bit too precious with the tutorial. Like, I gotta match exactly everything I do. Like I'm just working on the fly as well. So just make what you think looks good. Maybe you think this is not misshapen enough and you want to add more, go for it, because it might actually turn out better than what mine is. Now, before we move to the next part, how to save. How to save. Blender.
Oh,
Very, very easy. You just go save as, and you just get one file. It's called .blend.
I'm David. I work as a customer service engineer for the Czech Republic and Slovakia. I'm responsible for taking care of the customer's need. So if there is an
Did you guys know that Blender 4.0 had a change that makes it more realistic by default? Or that there's a new technology that is going to expand the uses for 3D exponentially? Well, you would if you were on my free newsletter called This Week in 3D. The world of 3D. So sometimes a feature, email address, and by me. Now on to the tutorial. Welcome back to the Donut Show, where we make sad little donuts that we cannot eat. This is where we finished up at the end of part 1. We've got our nice looking donut, and now we're going to make that icing, which looks complex but is actually fairly simple. Now, as I mentioned before, if you want to add an object, you go Shift A, right? And then you start with something that resembles what you're trying to create. But we already have something that resembles the exact shape we want to create. It's the donut, because we want the icing around the donut. So let's just reuse this information. So we can do that by duplicating the object. And if you don't know the hotkey for it, you could just go Object, and then you'd find it here where it says Shift. Shift D, so Shift D. Now when you hit that, you are in a placement state, essentially, like it's duplicated and it's now saying, where do you want to place it? Now in our case, and actually often, you don't actually want to change its placement. You want to duplicate it exactly where it was. So you can cancel the movement by hitting Escape or right-clicking. Now when you do that, it looks like it's canceled the duplication, but you can see in your outliner, it has duplicated it. You've got two objects, but it's just in the exact same place, which is what we want. So first things first, we need to name them, or else we could get very confused. Very easily. So you can name an object by just double clicking it in the outliner and then just typing in the object. The other way you can name something, I'll just show you the second way. If you select the Taurus 0.001, that is over the 3D viewport. If you hit F outliner to find your object. So with our icing object selected, let's go into edit mode by hitting Tab. So we want the icing on the top, which means this bottom half of our mesh here is redundant. Don't need it, so we want to delete it. So if we just dragged over the bottom here, you can see it looks like we've selected the bottom half of our donut, but if you were to move around, you would see, oh, we haven't actually. It's only selected, annoyingly, what is facing the camera. Where there's a mesh, it's not gone through the mesh. A lot of users find this annoying. I agree. Sometimes it seems like that would be the more default one that would make more sense, but anyway, don't want to argue. So if you want to select through a mesh, you can go up to here in your top navigation. And now through the mesh as I move around it. By the way, you might find it like when you're in this state, it's kind of hard to select. Like it's easy to kind of accidentally select what is above it, and depending on what you've got at your end, that might directly on the side on of your donut is to just click one of these like in your gizmo here instead of just drag X or the Y. And now we're in that toggle to at any all the way through the mesh. So just hit the delete key. You get an extra option here of what do you want to delete: edges, faces. You want the vertices, that's everything. And now we have, if we go back to object mode, and then let's turn off toggle X-ray as well. And you can see it's working. We got half the donut on top of itself. But as you move around, you can see you get some flickering. Now, this flickering happens, and it's actually a very common, it's actually a good warning sign to you as an artist, because it means you've got faces on top of faces, and the 3D software doesn't know which face it wants to render, right? So it's like sometimes saying it's the front face, no, the back face, the front face, and there's no understanding. Sometimes you can actually spot it in TV shows and like VFX or like low budget stuff. You can see something flickering in the background, and I'm like, ooh, there it is, Z fighting. That's what it's called, Z fighting, or Z fighting if you're not American. So what we want to do is we want to give thickness to our icing. So we can do that with a solidify modifier. So adding another modifier, make sure you've got your icing selected, not your donut. And then here where you've got add modifier, we're going to go generate solidify. Okay. Now it's made it worse. It's actually added a thickness to our mesh there, but it's actually done it the wrong way. So it's with the normals. Yeah, what is it? It's trying to put the extra bit inside the donut. So we can change that by just changing the offset here in the solidifier settings. Just drag that all the way to 1. Some of you might have actually found that it was correct before, just depending on which way your normals were. If that's the case, keep it at -1, but everyone else keep it at 1. We just want to make sure it's actually outside. Okay. Let's just increase the thickness a little bit too. Let's go, yeah, 0.025. That looks pretty good. And great, we've got what looks like a yarmulke on our donut, a perfectly straight edge little hat for our donut. So let's make this look more like icing. So to lots of key that we can't see. The mesh, and that's because the solidify modifier is obstructing our view. So these little boxes here, as I mentioned before, like this is to hide it from viewport. But if you want to just hide it from your edit mode, which is the state that we are in right now, the box next to it is the one that you uncheck, which means in object mode, when you're tabbed in object mode, you can still see it, but edit mode, it's it's temporarily hidden for you. So if I was to select one of these points here and move it down, you can see that it's working, but it would be, again, a lot of effort to go round and round and do these one by one. So we want to use that old familiar proportional fall off tool again. So proportional editing on, and now as I move it down, let's just lower the slider way down here, and then let's pull this down. Okay, now we'll find issues. If we move to the side here, we can see the first issue we've discovered is that this is separating from our mesh here, and that's not what icing does. When it dribbles down, it follows the shape of the donut all the way down. So what we want to do is snap, undo it a number of times, snap the snap the vertices to our donut underneath it, right? So for that, we need to turn on snapping up here. Okay, now there are a number of ways to snap in Blender. The default way is increment, which just means the like the grid floor there. Like if you were to just like move it around, you can see it's just it is actually working correctly. We can see these are not going through the mesh. So why does it look like it is? The reason for that is that there's actually just not enough. Oh, 4x. Okay, 4x specifically, because it seems. Or if you can't remember it for whatever reason, you can also find, because it's like no other application seems to use it. Modify, generate, subdivision, surface. Now, the order of these does matter. Okay, you want your it's important it happens of this icing. Another issue to call out, you can see it's got this this shape that goes around. Yes, so far so good, but then it goes up, and it's like it would be better if it went around and then tucked in and touched the edge of it, because that would look more like real liquid wood. So we can solve that by just changing one of the settings in the solidify modify. It's not one of those things that you would figure out or know where it is. It's just over time you learn where some of these settings are. But essentially here, the edge data. So we want to change the edge data to say that before you do the solidify step, add a crease on the inner part right here. If we increase this all the way to 1, it now creates a sharpened edge just on that inner part there. So the rest of it is a smoothed edge, but the middle one, there's a crease, so it's making a sharp edge there. And it just gives it just a little bit more realism. Just looks a little bit closer to what you would imagine real icing would do. Okay, now for the cool bit. All right, so if you look at reference donuts, right, yes, you've got these little wavy bits, but where the icing is really liquidy, it'll often break off from this wave here, and it'll create a trail that goes down underneath the donut, right? It just sort of drips all the way down. Whoops, bumped the microphone. So we can do that, but not the way we were doing it before. If we just took one of these points and then like dragged it all the way down like that, there wouldn't be enough information there, right? You can see you just get this like stretched look, and it doesn't look great, okay? So essentially we need to give it more information, and we couldn't just do it by like adding more and more subdivision surfaces. We need to actually like break this shape here and create a new shape that goes down. So we need to extrude. So if I select this vertice and then the one next to it by holding down shift, I don't think I mentioned it, but yeah, if you want to select two things at once, shift select. Anyways, so if we select two vertices like that, we want to extrude it downward by hitting E. So when you tap E, it's similar to
Oh, finally it works. Okay, that looks kind of weird. Maybe. Oh, goodness. I'm just gonna guess. Oh, that's she doesn't even look too bad. Okay, not bad. Oh, it's stupid. Actually, I thought it's a lot, so. Okay, that's something that man was not happy with. No! Please say that was safe. Please, auto save. Please. Please. Please, I'm gonna wait for this. Shut up, please. afraid everything's gonna be gone. Then I'm just quitting. What? Wait, is everything gone? Everything's gone. Okay. Okay, no. That's it. Bye. That's fair. I'm not kidding. I hope you guys enjoyed though. But it's craft. I loved everything. So that's basically the end. Bye. Well, it was fun though. Thank you for your support.